The first time I found Walt Brannan's motorhome plugged into the side of my garage, I thought maybe he had made an honest mistake. The second time, he parked that big beige thing across my driveway, blocked me in after a 12-hour shift, and told me a woman living alone had no real use for a 220 line anyway. The third time, a violation notice showed up in my mailbox because my porch swing was the wrong shade of blue, and that was when I stopped trying to be the polite neighbor. This happened in 1995, out in a little development called Briarwood Meadows, about 20 minutes outside Dayton, Ohio, the kind of place where every mailbox matched. Every lawn had a rule attached to it, and everyone knew which grocery store you used, even if they pretended they did not care. I was 47 then, working payroll at St. Agnes Hospital, raising nobody anymore because my 2 sons had grown up and scattered to opposite ends of the country, and learning how to live in a house that had been too quiet since my husband Tom passed away 3 years earlier. Tom had built that garage line himself. He'd been a carpenter, not the kind who made fancy furniture for magazines, but the kind who could look at a crooked shelf, sigh, and fix it before you finished explaining what was wrong. He used the line for his table saw, his old air compressor, and a ridiculous little welder he bought at a garage sale because he swore he was going to restore a 1956 Ford pickup one day. He never got around to that truck. It sat behind our garage for 2 summers after he died, covered in the tarp that flapped every time a storm rolled through, and eventually I sold it to a young man from Springfield who promised he would bring it back to life. I watched it leave on a trailer and cried so hard I had to sit on the kitchen floor afterward, not because of the truck exactly, but because it felt like one more thing proving time did not wait for anybody. By 1995, I had finally started using that garage for myself. I had a small workbench, a little radio, some shelves with jars of screws Tom had labeled in his crooked handwriting, and a space where I could go when the house felt too still. So when I pulled in one warm Thursday evening and saw a thick orange cord snaking from my garage wall to Walt Brannan's motorhome, I stood there with my keys in my hand for a good 10 seconds before my brain caught up with what my eyes were seeing. The cord crossed my grass, ran under the hedge, and disappeared beneath the side door of that oversized camper he loved more than most people loved their children. Walt was standing beside it in a white sleeveless undershirt and khaki shorts, rinsing a fishing cooler with my hose like he had been born in my backyard. He was 50-something, broad in the shoulders, red-faced in the summer, and had the permanent expression of a man who believed every conversation was a negotiation he had already won. He looked over at me and smiled like we were sharing some private joke. He said, "Diane, there you are. I was beginning to think you had a late one." I looked at the cord, then at him. Why is your motorhome plugged into my garage?" He barely glanced at it. Battery was low. I figured you would not mind. You were at work, and the line was just sitting there. I remember blinking at him because the confidence of it was almost impressive in a sick way. It was like watching somebody walk into your living room, open your refrigerator, and ask why you were making such a face. I said, "That line is connected to my electric bill." He shrugged. "It is a couple dollars, Diane. We are neighbors. Neighbors help neighbors." I had heard that phrase my whole life, usually from decent people handing you a casserole after somebody died, or helping shovel snow when your back gave out. Coming out of Walt's mouth, it sounded like a locksmith testing a window. I told him to unplug it. He sighed, slow and theatrical, like I had asked him to cancel Christmas. Then he said, "Well, no need to get territorial. We all live in Briarwood. This is not a collection of little kingdoms." I did not say much after that. I waited while he disconnected the cord, watched him coil it like he was doing me a favor, and went inside with a tired little smile on my face that lasted just long enough to get me through the front door. Then I locked it, leaned my forehead against the wood, and felt that old familiar ache in my chest, the one that showed up whenever somebody mistook my quietness for weakness. I wish I could tell you I marched straight over there the next morning and set the whole thing right. I did not. I told myself it was a misunderstanding. I told myself Tom would have said, "Let it go, Di. It is not worth your blood pressure." And maybe he would have. Tom had a way of saying things that made you believe peace was the same thing as surrender, but peace and surrender are not the same thing. It took me a while to learn that. 3 nights later, I came home after payroll closed late. We had a new computer system at the hospital that summer, green letters on black screens, a machine that made a sound like it was chewing rocks whenever you tried to print more than 2 pages, and every person in administration acted like we had been handed the controls to a spaceship. I was tired, hungry, and still wearing my sensible shoes because I had not had the energy to switch into anything else. I turned onto Briarwood Lane and immediately saw the taillights of Walt's motorhome sitting right where my car needed to go. He had backed it into the mouth of my driveway. The orange cord was plugged into my garage again, and my own Buick was trapped behind it. For a moment, I honestly thought maybe I was looking at somebody else's house. Then I saw my blue porch swing, the one Tom had painted for me 15 years earlier, and I felt something inside me get very quiet, not calm. Quiet. The kind of quiet that comes right before a storm. I got out of my car, walked up to the motorhome door, and knocked hard enough to rattle the little plastic window. Walt opened it holding a can of beer. Behind him, I could see a tiny television playing a baseball game. A fishing rod leaned in the corner, and a plate of cold chicken wings on the counter. He said, "Well, look who made it home." I said, "Move your motor home." He smiled. "I just need another hour." I said, "Walt, I had been standing in the street for 10 minutes because you blocked my driveway." He took a sip of his beer, then looked past me at my car like he had never noticed it before. "Diane, your garage line was not being used. Mine is." I could not believe I was hearing it. I said, "That does not make it yours." And that was when he said it. He said, "You live alone. You do not need all that power sitting around." I felt my face go hot, but I did not raise my voice. I said, "You do not get to decide what I need." His smile changed then. It got smaller, colder. He said, "You know, people around here might find you easier to get along with if you stopped acting like everything belongs to you." I looked right at him and said, "Everything on my property does belong to me, Walls. That is usually how property works." Then I walked back to my car, got in, and waited while he moved that motorhome 1 inch at a time. So slowly you would have thought he was backing a ship into harbor. He did not apologize. He did not even look at me when he pulled away. The next morning, I found 2 envelopes in my mailbox, both printed on the thick cream stationery of the Briarwood Meadows Civic Association. Walt was the association president. Of course he was. The first notice said my porch swing was in violation of the approved exterior color palette. The second said the wooden arbor over my side garden was an unapproved structure and needed to be removed within 10 days. I sat at my kitchen table with those notices in front of me while the coffee went cold. The porch swing had been there longer than Walt had lived in Briarwood. The arbor was 6 feet from the street, partly hidden by climbing roses, and had never bothered anyone until the exact week I told him to stay off my property. That was when I understood what he was doing. The motorhome was not really about electricity. The notices were not really about the swing. Walt Brannan had spent so much of his life being the loudest man in every room that he had started to believe being challenged was the same thing as being attacked. And since I had challenged him, he needed to make an example out of me. That Sunday, I went to my first Civic Association meeting in years. It was held in the basement of the Briarwood Clubhouse, a low brick building next to the pool, where the chairs always smelled faintly of chlorine and old coffee. Walt sat at the folding table in front with a polished wooden gavel he had bought himself at an auction. He loved that gavel. He tapped it whenever someone spoke too long, which was often because most of the people in that room were retired, lonely, or both, and a civic meeting was the closest thing they had to a night out. Beside Walt sat Margot Ellis, the treasurer, who wore large glasses and took notes with the intensity of a courtroom stenographer, and the young insurance agent named Neil, who had somehow become secretary because nobody else raised their hand. I sat in the back at first, holding my notices. Walt saw me come in and gave me that same little smile, the one that said he'd been waiting. When he opened the floor for resident concerns, I stood. I said, "I received 2 violation notices this week. One for a porch swing that has been there for 15 years, and one for an arbor that existed before Mr. Brannan became president. I would like to know why these suddenly became urgent." Walt leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and said, "Mrs. Mercer, the association responds to written complaints. We do not choose what is brought to our attention." I said, "Who filed the complaints?" He smiled at Margot. Margot looked down at her papers. Then Walt said, "That information is not normally disclosed." I looked around the room. Some people shifted in their seats. A few avoided my eyes. And then Walt said that since you are making it personal, yes, I filed them. He said it like he was confessing to donating blood. He told everyone my swing was a visual inconsistency. He said the arbor could lower property values. Then he looked directly at me and added, "We cannot have residents deciding which rules apply to them." That was rich, coming from a man who had parked a 30-foot motorhome across somebody else's driveway. I told the room exactly what he had done. I told them about the court, the blocked driveway, and the way he had told me I did not need power because I lived alone. It got very quiet. Walt did not deny it. He just shook his head and said, "This is the problem with personal grievances. They cloud judgment." I remember staring at that man, at his pressed polo shirt and his smug little gavel, and thinking, fine. If you wanted to turn my life into paperwork, I knew how to handle paperwork. I had been doing payroll for nearly 20 years. I knew how to find a missing decimal point in 500 employee records. I knew how to trace an error backward until I found the person who caused it. And I knew something else. Briarwood Meadows had rules nobody had read in years. Everybody knew there were rules about fences and sheds and paint colors. Nobody knew the rules were 48 pages long, printed in tiny type, written in 1978, and full of things that had been ignored by almost every home on the street. That night I went into the garage, opened the old metal filing cabinet Tom had used for receipts, and found the binder from when we bought the house. Briarwood Meadows Covenanters and Community Restrictions. I carried it inside, poured myself a little glass of bourbon, put a legal pad beside me, and started reading. Part 2, The Midle. It began as anger, I will admit that. I wanted to know which rule Walt thought gave him the right to bully people. I wanted to find the sentence that made him believe a civic association was a throne and the rest of us were peasants. But the more I read, the stranger it got. There were rules about basketball hoops, rules about satellite dishes, rules about garden sheds, rules about holiday decorations, rules about fence posts, lawn ornaments, temporary vehicles, commercial vehicles, drainage runoff, driveway widths, even rules about the number of days a boat could sit in a driveway without being moved. I read until 1 in the morning, then got up for work at 6, then came home and read some more. By Wednesday, I had a yellow legal pad filled with notes. By Friday, I had 3 columns on a spreadsheet at work. 1 for the rule, 1 for the property, and 1 for whether the association had ever enforced it. I was careful. I did not use hospital equipment for anything improper. I wrote things down during my lunch break, then copied them at home on an old word processor Tom had bought me because he said I should have something better than a typewriter. The printer screeched like a wounded cat, but it got the job done. I did not go snooping in people's windows. I did not photograph their backyards. I looked at what anybody could see from the street, the same way Walt looked at mine. And what I found was almost funny. Margot, the treasurer, had a bright red awning over her porch that was not on any approved color list. Neil had a basketball hoop bolted to his garage, something the rules specifically banned unless it was portable. Half the neighborhood had fences that were too tall. 3 houses had storage sheds that had never been approved. Walt himself had a widened driveway that crossed into the drainage easement, plus a concrete pad behind his garage where he stored tools and equipment for his side business. He called it a handyman service. The Covenant called it an unapproved commercial operation. I knew I had to be careful. I did not want to become him. I did not want to take a clipboard and start ruining people's lives over a rose trellis or a bird bath. So I called the one person in Briarwood who'd all seemed to understand the difference between rules and fairness. His name was Eddie Romano. Eddie lived 3 houses down from me, had worked 35 years as a county surveyor, and grew tomatoes so big they looked like they had their own zip code. He was 72, widowed, always wore suspenders even in July, and had a basset hound named Lucille who dragged him down the street every morning like he was a piece of luggage. I took my notes over to his porch one Saturday, expecting him to tell me I was overreacting. Instead, he read quietly for about 15 minutes, scratched Lucille behind the ear, and said, "Diane, you have got a real mess here." I said, "I know." He said, "No, you do not. You think this is about a porch swing. This is about selective enforcement. That is how little tyrants operate. They do not need everybody afraid. They just need one person afraid at a time." Eddie helped me understand the easement issue. We drove to the county courthouse together the following week, down into the records basement where the air smelled like dust, old paper, and mildew. There were maps stacked in metal drawers, microfiche readers, and a woman named Shirley, who had worked there since the Nixon administration and treated every question like a personal insult until you brought her a donut. Eddie found the old plat map for Briarwood Meadows. Walt's widened driveway had been poured over the drainage easement by nearly 4 feet. His concrete pad was even worse. Water from his property was supposed to run through a shallow channel between the houses. Instead, it had been redirected toward the side yard of the Harpers, an older couple who had been complaining for years that their garden turned into a muddy swamp every spring. Walt had convinced them it was just bad luck. That was Walt in a nutshell. If something benefited him, it was common sense. If it hurt somebody else, it was bad luck. I spent the next week putting together what I called the Briarwood Fair Enforcement File. It was not a threat. It was a report. I wrote in plain language, because nobody wants to read legal language after dinner. I listed the rules the association had suddenly decided to enforce against me, then listed examples showing those same rules have been ignored everywhere else. I included no names in the summary, only numbers and categories, 43 visible covenant violations, 3 current enforcement actions, 2 of them aimed at my house, 1 at a widower on the next block because his trash cans had been left out after the pickup day. I made copies at a print shop near the mall. The kid behind the counter looked at my stack and said, "Lady, are you running for mayor?" I said, "No, honey, I am just tired of being treated like I do not own my own front porch." On Saturday night, Eddie and I walked the neighborhood and left a copy in every mailbox. I was nervous the whole time. Not scared of Walt, exactly, though I was scared of what kind of person I might become if I let myself enjoy this too much. But by Sunday morning, the phone was ringing. The first call came from Martha Sloan, who had lived there 20 years and had a small white birdhouse on a pole in her yard. She said, "Diane, does this mean they can find me over my birdhouse?" I said, "If they decide to enforce the rules exactly as written, yes." She went quiet. Then she said, "Well, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard." By noon, people were standing in their driveways talking. By dinner, there were messages on answering machines all over Briarwood. The association called an emergency meeting for Monday night. Walt thought he was getting ahead of it. He was not. When I walked into the clubhouse, every chair was taken. People stood along the walls. Some held copies of my report. Some looked angry. Some looked scared. Walt looked pale. I had never seen that color on him before. He opened with that polished voice he used when he wanted to sound reasonable. He said, "There has been an irresponsible document circulated in this neighborhood, designed to create panic and division." Before he could finish, Martha Sloan stood up and said, "Is my birdhouse illegal or not?" The room laughed, not kindly. Walt tried to tap his gavel, but it did not do much against 50 people talking at once. Then Eddie got up. He did not speak loudly, but when Eddie spoke, people listened. He said, "Walt, the question is not whether every last rule has been broken. The question is why only certain people get punished when you are angry at them." Walt's face tightened. He said, "That is a serious accusation." Eddie said, "Good. It should be." Then Walt looked at me. He said, "Mrs. Mercer has been bitter since a small disagreement about a utility line." I stood up slowly. I said, "You blocked my driveway and plugged your motorhome into my garage without permission. You told me I did not need electricity because I live alone. Then you sent me violations when I told you to stop. That is not a disagreement, Walt. That is retaliation." He laughed once, sharp and ugly. He said, "You are making yourself sound like a victim." I said, "No, I'm making you sound like you." You could have heard a pin drop after that. I had come prepared. I proposed 3 things. First, an immediate suspension of all pending violations unless they involved a real safety issue. Second, a neighborhood vote to remove Walt as president and elect a temporary committee. Third, a complete review of the covenanters so they could not be used as a club against people for petty reasons. Walt tried to say I could not call for a vote. He was right in a technical sense. The president could not be removed during a normal monthly meeting. But I had read the bylaws. With 25% of homeowners signing a petition, we could call a special membership meeting. By then, I had 38 signatures in my purse. I laid them on the table in front of him. He looked down at them, then back at me. That was the first time I saw fear in his eyes, real fear. The special meeting was held 2 weeks later in the Fellowship Hall of St. Luke's Church because the Briarwood clubhouse was too small. The pastor let us use it for free after Martha told him what was going on. Walt came with a lawyer friend from his fishing club, but that man took one look at the rules, the signatures, the meeting notice, and the stack of documentation I had brought, then spent most of the evening staring at his shoes. Walt lost the vote by a landslide. Marga resigned before the ballots were counted. Neil looked relieved enough to float home. We elected a temporary committee, with Eddie as chair, Martha as secretary, and me handling records because apparently the universe had decided I had not done enough paperwork yet. We passed an amnesty period for old cosmetic violations, and we started rewriting the rules so nobody could use them as a personal weapon again. I should have felt triumphant. Mostly I felt tired. I went home, sat on my blue porch swing, and listened to the cicadas. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe. Then, 3 days later, a county code notice arrived in my mailbox. Someone had filed a complaint about the electrical line on my garage, claiming it was unsafe and improperly used. I stood at the counter holding that letter, and I knew exactly who had filed it. Walls had lost the association, but he had not lost his appetite for control. He had only changed tools. The inspector came that Thursday. His name was Mr. Haskins, a quiet man with a clipboard and a sunburned neck. He looked at the garage line, checked the breaker box, asked a few questions, and finally said, "Mom, I do not know who complained, but this work is permitted and safe. You are fine." Then he paused and added, "Whoever filed this knew enough to be annoying, but not enough to be correct." I thanked him, then went inside and pulled out the old VCR tapes from my security camera. After Tom died, I had installed a simple black and white camera over the garage door because somebody had been stealing tools from sheds around the neighborhood. The thing recorded onto VHS tapes, and every few days I had to rewind them manually like it was 1982. I put one tape in, fast-forwarded through hours of blurry driveway footage, and there he was, Walt, walking across my lawn with a flashlight, kneeling beside the garage wall, pointing at the electrical outlet while somebody else held a clipboard. Then, 2 nights later, another tape caught him standing near my porch, taking pictures of my swing. The man had filed the complaint himself, then came back to document what he hoped would get me fined. I did not call the police that night. I did not pound on his door. I called a lawyer named Rita Alvarez, who handled property disputes and had a voice like she was already tired of nonsense before you explained it. I showed her the tapes. She watched without speaking, then said, "Diane, this is not just a disagreement anymore. This is harassment." She sent Walt a formal letter demanding he stop entering my property, stop filing false complaints, and stop representing himself as part of the association. That last part mattered because after he was voted out, people started receiving typed violation notices again. They came on old association letterhead with carbon copy marks at the bottom, warning people about garage doors, hedges, sheds, even the number of lawn chairs on a porch. Walt had gone from president to counterfeit president. He was relying on the fact that most people were still afraid of official-looking paper. I made another neighborhood notice. This one was shorter. It said, "Any letter claiming to come from the Briarwood Meadows Civic Association must be verified with the temporary committee. Do not pay fines. Do not remove property. Do not panic. Fear only works when people suffer alone." That sentence got repeated all over the neighborhood. It ended up taped to the bulletin board at the dry cleaner. It ended up under the glass at the diner near Route 48. And it ended up making Walt angrier than anything I had done before. Part 3. The end. Walt's final move began with a delivery truck. It was a grey Saturday morning in October, the kind where the leaves stuck to the sidewalk because it had rained all night. I was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee when a flatbed pulled up outside his house. 2 men unloaded metal posts, reflective signs, orange cones, and what looked like a small wooden toll booth. At first I thought he was having work done. Then I saw the sign, Bearer Wood Community, Security, Checkpoint, Authorized Resident Patrol. I actually laughed, because sometimes something is so absurd your body has no other response. Then I saw a little boy on a bicycle stop at the end of the street because Walt had put cones across half the road, and the laugh disappeared. By lunchtime he had the booth set up near the entrance to Briarwood. He sat inside in a windbreaker, writing down license plate numbers on a yellow legal pad. He told people he was keeping the neighborhood safe after a recent string of burglaries in another development across town. He told an elderly couple they should report all visitors to him. He asked a teenage girl where she was going when she walked her dog. He acted like losing the association had not taken away his power, only forced him to build a new version of it out of plywood and nerve. People were scared, not because Walt had any legal authority, He did not. They were scared because he was loud, confident, and standing behind a sign that looked official enough from a distance. That was his whole trick. He had always counted on distance. I called Eddie. He came over with Lucille, who sniffed one of the cones and lifted a leg on it before anybody could stop her. That was probably the first useful thing that happened all day. Eddie looked at the booth, rubbed his chin, and said, "That is sitting on a county right-of-way." Then he looked at me and said, "You ready to finish this?" I told him I had been ready since the night he told me I did not need power because I lived alone. We did not tear anything down ourselves. I want to be clear about that. It would have felt good for about 5 minutes. Then it would have turned us into the story he wanted to tell about us. Instead, we organized. We called the county road department. We called the sheriff's office. Rita filed an emergency request based on the forged notices and the intimidation. And because Martha had a cousin who worked at the Dayton Daily News, a reporter named Jason Bell agreed to come to a public meeting at the church hall that Tuesday night. Walt showed up, of course. He stood at the front of the room in a navy windbreaker, arms crossed, jaw tight, acting as if he were the victim of a town that had suddenly gone crazy. The church hall was packed. Parents came because their kids had been questioned at the checkpoint. All the residents came because they were tired of being frightened by fake notices. People who had never said more than hello to each other were sitting side by side, whispering, comparing stories, realizing for the first time how many of them had been pushed around in private. I stood near the front with a small television on the cart and a VCR beneath it. The kind of setup every school in America had in 1995. I put in the tape from my garage camera. The grainy black and white footage showed Walt crossing my lawn. Then it showed him pointing at the electrical outlet. Then we played the footage from 2 nights later, him photographing my porch swing, crouched under the porch light like a man trying to gather evidence against a criminal. The room went quiet. Walt shook his head and said, "This is being taken out of context." I said, "Then please explain the context." He did not answer. The county inspector spoke next. He said the checkpoint was an unauthorized obstruction on public right-of-way. The road department representative said it had to come down immediately. The sheriff's deputy said Walt had no authority to question residents, record their plates, or present himself as neighborhood security. Walt finally snapped. He stood up so fast his chair fell backward. He said, "Somebody has to keep order around here. People have no pride anymore. They paint their swings blue, leave toys in the yard, park whatever they want, and expect the rest of us to live with it." I remember looking at him, really looking at him, and seeing something I had missed before. Walt did not love order. He loved obedience. Order was just the word he used because it sounded better. I walked closer to him, not angry anymore, not even shaking. I said, "You do not want a neighborhood, Walt. You want an audience." The reporter wrote that down. I saw his pen move. Walt looked at me like he wanted to say something cruel, something final, something that would put me back in the place he thought I belonged. But the room was full now. He was not talking to one widow in a driveway anymore. He was talking to a whole community that had finally stopped being afraid, one house at a time. The county gave him 48 hours to remove the booth, the signs, and the cones. He did not. So on Friday morning, 2 county trucks came down Briarwood Lane. One had a crew from road maintenance. The other carried a small backhoe. A few neighbors stood in their yards pretending not to watch. I stood on my porch with Eddie and Martha. Lucille was there too, of course, wagging her tail like she had been invited to a parade. Walt came out in his bathrobe, yelling before the truck had even stopped. His wife, Denise, stood behind him in the doorway, crying quietly. That was the only moment I felt sorry for anyone in that house. I do not know what it is like to live beside a person who needs to control the weather, the road, the mailbox, and every breath in the room. The crew removed the signs first, then they pulled up the posts. Then they lifted the little wooden booth onto a flatbed, and it looked smaller than I expected. That is the funny thing about false power. Once somebody turns the lights on, it is usually made of cheap lumber and screws. A few weeks later, after the drainage review was complete, the county made Walt remove part of his illegal concrete pad too. The work crew broke it up on a cold November morning. Walt stood in his driveway with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the backhoe tear apart the concrete he had poured over the easement years earlier. I walked out to get my mail, and he saw me. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "Happy now." I thought about all the nights I'd sat at my kitchen table feeling small. I thought about my blue porch swing, Tom's handwriting on the jars in the garage, the VHS tape, The old ladies frightened by fake fines. The little boy stopped on his bike by a man in a booth pretending to be sheriff. And I said, "No, Walt, I am tired now." There is a difference. He looked at me for a long moment, then turned away. I never spoke to him again after that. He moved out of Briarwood the next spring. I heard he went to Florida to live near his brother, though I do not know if that was true. The niece stayed behind for a while, then sold the house. The temporary committee rewrote the covenances. We got rid of the rules about porch colors and decorative dirt houses. We kept the safety rules, the drainage rules, the things that actually mattered. And we put one line into the new association charter that I was especially proud of. No violation could be enforced unless the rule had been applied consistently across the neighborhood. It was not perfect. No neighborhood is. People still argued about barking dogs, Christmas lights, and whose teenager drove too fast around the curve by the clubhouse. But something had changed. People started talking to one another before calling somebody an authority. They knocked on doors. They explained. They listened. As for me, I kept the porch swing blue. Every few years I repainted it the same shade. A little faded, a little stubborn, still standing. Sometimes I sit out there in the evening and think about the first extension cord, that stupid orange cord crossing my grass like it belonged there. I still wonder whether I should have stopped Walt sooner. I wonder whether things might have turned out differently if I had been louder on day one, or kinder, or less patient, or more patient. But then I remember the truth. I did not start that fight. I just stopped making room for it in my life. So tell me what you think. Was I right to dig into the rules and expose everything, or did I let one arrogant neighbor turn me into someone I did not want to be? Would you have let that first cord slide, or would you have shut it down the moment you saw it? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because the older I get, the more I believe every neighborhood has a Walt somewhere. And sometimes the only thing standing between a bully and a whole community is one person willing to say no. Not here, not anymore. And if this story reminded you of somebody you have dealt with, share it with a friend, subscribe for more stories like this, and tell us where you were watching from. I would love to know how far these porches, driveways, and hard-earned lessons can travel.